Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Before we ride into the heart of today's story, a tale of trust, betrayal, and the long, dark road of vengeance, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. You don't want to miss a single story from the unforgiving heart of the Old West. Now, settle in, pour yourself a whiskey, and listen close to the legend of the man who put his faith in the wrong badge. The sun over Serenity Valley was a benevolent god, casting a golden glow upon the sprawling acres of the Stone Ranch. It was a land of quiet promises, of rich soil and sweet water, a place where a man could wash the blood and dust of a former life from his hands and build something that would last. Jedediah Jed Stone was such a man. There was a time when his name, spoken in hushed tones in smoky saloons from Dodge City to Tombstone, meant trouble. The name Jedediah the Hawk had been synonymous with a lightning-fast draw and eyes that could read a man's soul, and usually, his last intention. But the Hawk had flown his last flight years ago. Now, he was just Jed, a husband, a father, and a rancher whose only battles were against stubborn cattle and the occasional dry spell. His wife, Sarah, was the architect of this peace. She was a woman whose laughter could charm the birds from the cottonwood trees and whose spirit was as resilient as the prairie grass. She had seen the man behind the gunslinger's reputation, the weary soul longing for an anchor, and had given him a harbor in her heart. Their son, 10-year-old Sammy, was the living embodiment of their shared dream. He had his mother's bright eyes and his father's quiet strength, a boy whose world was defined by the loving expanse of the ranch and the tall tales his father would spin by the fireside. This particular morning was like any other, painted in the gentle hues of domestic bliss. Jed was mending a fence on the northern pasture, the rhythmic thud of his hammer a peaceful counterpoint to the meadowlark's song. He worked with a practiced ease, his broad shoulders and calloused hands a testament to a life of hard, honest labor. He paused, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his glove, and looked back towards the homestead. The ranch house, built with his own two hands, stood sturdy and proud, a thin ribbon of smoke curling lazily from the chimney. Sarah would be in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, the warm, comforting scent of baking bread soon to be carried on the breeze. Sammy would likely be down by the creek, skipping stones and dreaming the boundless dreams of boyhood. A smile touched Jed's lips, a genuine and burdened expression that had become his new normal. This was his world, his everything. The ghosts of his past were just that, ghosts, faded and powerless against the brilliant sun of his present. But a shadow was creeping towards Serenity Valley, a darkness that had been gathering on the horizon for months. The Black Vulture Gang, a pack of ruthless outlaws led by the notorious Silas the Butcher Kane, had been terrorizing the territory. They were a plague of violence and fear, descending on isolated ranches and small towns with a savagery that left communities shattered. They stole more than just livestock and money. They stole peace of mind, leaving behind a trail of blood and ashes. The talk in the town of Serenity, the small but growing settlement that served as the valley's hub, was filled with a nervous energy. Men spoke in low, worried tones, casting anxious glances towards the hills. The local sheriff, a well-meaning but aging man named Abernathy, was out of his depth, his authority no match for the vulture's sheer brutality. Jed had done his best to remain detached from the growing panic. He had fortified his ranch as best he could, his old instincts stirring beneath the surface. He kept his cold peacemaker, the very gun that had earned him his fearsome reputation, cleaned and oiled, hidden away in a locked chest. He had promised Sarah he would never again live by the gun, and it was a promise he intended to keep. He was a rancher now, not a lawman, not a gunslinger. His responsibility was to the two people in that sturdy house, not to the town's troubles. The arrival of Marshal Clayton Thompson was, for many, an answer to their prayers. He rode into Serenity one blistering afternoon, a figure straight out of a dime novel. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a square jaw, a neatly trimmed mustache, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His clothes were immaculate, his twin Colt revolvers holstered high on his hips, their ivory handles gleaming in the sun. He carried himself with an air of unshakable confidence and authority. He spoke in a deep, resonant voice, his words carefully chosen, promising order, justice, and an end to the reign of the Black Vultures. "I was sent by the territorial governor," he announced to the crowd that had gathered in front of the sheriff's office. I've been tasked with bringing the rule of law to this valley, and I will not rest until Silas Kane and his entire gang are either behind bars or 6 feet under." A cheer went up from the townsfolk. Here was a man of action, a true hero of the West. He was everything Sheriff Abernathy was not. Within days, Marshal Thompson had organized a town militia, drilling the men in the main street, turning shopkeepers and farmers into a disciplined, if inexperienced, fighting force. He was a whirlwind of decisive action. He spoke of strategy, of fortifications, of taking the fight to the enemy. He was charismatic and persuasive, winning over even the most skeptical residents. Jed first met him a week after his arrival. He had ridden into town for supplies, and the marshal had approached him outside the general store. "You're Jedediah Stone, aren't you?" Thompson asked, his voice friendly but with an undercurrent of something else, something Jed couldn't quite place. "Just Jed," he replied, his gaze steady. "I don't go by the other name anymore." Thompson smiled, a disarming, politician smile. "I've heard the stories. They say you were one of the fastest draws in the territory. A man like you could be a great asset to this town." Jed shook his head, his tone firm. "My gunfighting days are over, Marshal. I have a family to think about. I'm a rancher." Of course," Thompson said, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "A man's right to peace is what we're fighting for. But the vultures, they don't respect a man's peace. They see a ranch like yours, isolated and prosperous, and they see a target." The marshal's words were a cold spike of fear in Jed's gut, touching on the very anxiety he had been trying to suppress. "I can handle my own," Jed said, his voice a low growl. "I have no doubt," Thompson said smoothly. "But no man is an island. We're all in this together. I'm drawing up a plan to protect the entire valley, a network of lookouts and a central defense here in town. I'd value your input. A man with your experience would see things a simple lawman might miss." Jed was wary. He had spent years avoiding men like Thompson, men who lived and breathed authority, whose world was one of stark black and white, of law and outlaw. But the marshal was clever. He didn't ask Jed to strap on his guns. He asked for his knowledge, appealing to his desire to protect his family. Against his better judgment, Jed found himself listening, drawn in by the marshal's apparent sincerity and the logic of his plans. Over the next few weeks, Jed became an unofficial advisor to the marshal. He met with him several times, poring over maps of the valley in the sheriff's office. He pointed out strategic locations for lookouts, identified choke points in the canyons where the gang could be ambushed, and described the best ways to fortify the town. He found himself impressed by Thompson's sharp mind and his seemingly genuine dedication. The marshal listened intently, nodding, asking intelligent questions. He exuded an aura of competence and righteousness that was hard to resist. The whole town was under his spell. They called him the savior of serenity, their trust in him absolute. One evening, as Jed was preparing to ride home after a long meeting, Thompson placed a hand on his shoulder. "Jed," he said, his blue eyes filled with a sincere gravity, "I know you've put your past behind you, and I respect that. But these are desperate times. If the vultures make a concerted push, they'll likely hit the outlying ranches first to draw us out. Yours is the largest and most prosperous. It would be a tempting prize." Jed's jaw tightened. "I'll be ready. I know. But I need to know your setup. How many men do you have? Where are your weak points? If you get hit, I need to know the best way to send reinforcements. I need to know what you're protecting." The marshal paused, his gaze unwavering. "Think of your wife, your boy. This information could be the difference between life and death. You can trust me, Jed. I'm here to protect you." That night, looking at his sleeping son, the boy's face a picture of innocent tranquility, and watching Sarah as she sat by the fire, her needlework in her lap, her expression serene, Jed made a fateful decision. The marshal was right. This wasn't about his past or his pride. It was about protecting this precious piece he had built. He couldn't do it alone. He had to place his trust in the law, in the man who represented it. The next day, he rode back into town and laid it all out for Marshal Thompson. He drew a detailed map of his ranch, marking the location of the house, the barns, the wells. He explained the number of ranch hands he employed and where they were bunked. He described the secret cellar beneath the main house, reinforced and well-stocked, where he planned to hide Sarah and Sammy if trouble came. He even mentioned the strong box hidden beneath the floorboards of his bedroom, where he kept the entirety of his life savings, money he had set aside for Sammy's future. He told the Marshal everything, holding nothing back. He was placing the lives of his family, his entire world, into this man's hands. Marshal Thompson listened with a quiet, focused intensity. He nodded, his expression grim and reassuring. "Thank you, Jed," he said when Jed had finished. "This is exactly what I needed. Now I can build a proper defense plan. You've done the right thing. Your family will be safe. I give you my word." As Jed rode away from the town, a sense of relief washed over him. He had shared the burden. He was no longer alone in this fight. The trust felt solid, a shield against the encroaching darkness. He looked up at the vast, clear sky, at the benevolent sun warming his face, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that the dawn of a new, secure day was breaking over Serenity Valley. He didn't see the glint in the Marshal's eyes as Thompson watched him go, a cold, calculating shimmer that held no warmth, no righteousness. Only the chilling avarice of a predator who had just been handed the keys to the lamb's pen. The false dawn was beautiful, but the night that was to follow would be absolute. The weeks following Jed's full disclosure to Marshal Thompson were marked by an unnerving calm, the kind of stillness that often precedes a storm. The drills of the town militia continued with renewed vigor, their movements becoming sharper, more coordinated under the Marshal's watchful eye. Thompson himself seemed to be a man possessed by his duty. He was a constant presence in Serenity, his tall frame a reassuring sight on the dusty main street. He spoke with the ranchers, consulted with the blacksmith, and even shared a sarsaparilla with the children on the porch of the general store. He was weaving himself into the very fabric of the community, becoming not just a lawman, but a trusted friend and protector. Jed, for his part, allowed the Marshal's confidence to soothe his own deep-seated anxieties. The act of sharing his plans, of placing his trust in another, had lifted a heavy weight from his shoulders. He focused on his work, on the rhythms of the ranch that had healed him once before. He spent his days in the saddle, riding the perimeter of his land, the familiar weight of a rifle in its scabbard a comforting presence, but no longer the constant companion it had once been. His evenings were a sanctuary of familial warmth. He'd watch with a quiet pride as Sarah taught Sammy to read by the warm light of a kerosene lamp, the boy's brow furrowed in concentration. He'd listen to his wife's gentle hum as she mended clothes, a sound more precious to him than any treasure. These were the moments he had divulged his secrets to protect, the life he had entrusted to the Marshal's care. His interactions with Thompson became more frequent, and seemingly more friendly. The Marshal would occasionally ride out to the ranch, always under the guise of official business. "Just checking the sightlines from your western ridge, Jed," he'd say, or wanted to see for myself how long it would take a relief party to get here from town. During these visits, Thompson's charm was on full display. He complimented Sarah on her garden, praising the vibrant colors of her hollyhocks. He showed a genuine interest in Sammy, asking the boy about his chores and even whittling a small, crude horse for him from a block of pine. Sammy was captivated, looking up at the Marshal with wide, admiring eyes. Here was a real-life hero, a man with a shining star on his chest. "He seems like a good man," Sarah said one evening, after the Marshal had departed. She was standing at the window, watching his lone figure recede into the twilight. "A godsend for this valley." Jed, sitting at the table cleaning a bridle, grunted in agreement. "He knows what he's doing. For the first time, I think we might have a chance against the vultures." Yet, even as he said the words, a small, dissonant chord was struck somewhere deep within him. It was a flicker of the old instinct, the part of him that had survived years of violence by reading the subtle tells in a man's character. There was something about Thompson's perfection that felt rehearsed. His smiles, though broad and frequent, never quite seemed to reach his eyes. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, were like chips of ice, constantly observing, calculating, assessing. When he looked at Jed's prosperous ranch, at the healthy livestock and the sturdy buildings, Jed sometimes felt as though the Marshal wasn't seeing a home to be protected, but an asset to be appraised. He dismissed these feelings as ghosts of his old paranoia, the unwelcome residue of a life he had left behind. He was a husband and a father now, not a cynical gunslinger reading treachery in every shadow. Thompson was the law. To doubt him was to doubt the very possibility of order in a chaotic world. One sweltering afternoon, the Marshal arrived with a more specific purpose. He carried a map of the entire valley, a much more detailed version than the one they had previously worked on. He spread it across the dining table, the same table where his family shared their meals, their laughter, their lives. "Jed, I've been thinking," Thompson began, his finger tracing the lines on the map. "Cain is a cunning devil. He won't hit us where we're strongest. A direct assault on the town would be suicide, and he knows it. He'll use a distraction." He tapped a finger directly on the location of the stone ranch. "He'll hit you, Jed. He'll hit you hard, expecting me to empty the town of able-bodied men to ride to your rescue. And while we're gone, his main force will sweep in and take Serenity." The logic was sound, chillingly so. Jed felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in his stomach. "So what's your plan?" Jed asked, his voice low. "A trap," Thompson said, a glint of excitement in his eyes. "We let them think they're succeeding. I'll position a small group of my best men in the hills overlooking your ranch. The moment the vultures attack, my men will signal the town. But I won't ride out with the main force. I'll stay behind with a hidden reserve. The real trap will be sprung here, in Serenity. As for you, your job is the hardest of all. You have to hold them off. Just long enough. Can you do it?" Jed looked at the map, at the small, inked square that represented his home. He thought of Sarah and Sammy. "I'll need to know exactly where your men will be, and how they'll signal." "Of course," the Marshal said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He leaned in closer, the scent of bay rum and dust filling the air. "This stays between us, Jed. The fewer people who know the real plan, the better. No one. Not your wife, not your ranch hands. Loose lips can get us all killed." And so, Jed was drawn deeper into the web. Under the guise of planning a defense, Thompson extracted every last detail of Jed's world. He learned the nightly routines of the ranch hands, the time they turned in, the frequency of their patrols. He asked about the sturdiness of the cellar doors, the thickness of the house's walls. He even inquired about Jed's own habits. "Where will you make your stand, Jed?" "The hayloft in the barn. A second-story window. I need to know where the fighting will be thickest." Jed, believing he was planning for a desperate defense, answered every question. He showed Thompson the reinforced shutters on the windows, the firing slits he had discreetly cut into the walls of the master bedroom. He explained his plan to get Sarah and Sammy into the hidden cellar the moment trouble started. "Good," Thompson murmured, his eyes scanning the room, lingering for a moment on the floorboards near the bed. "Very thorough. You've thought of everything." The final piece of the betrayal fell into place a few days later. A lone rider, a young man from a neighboring ranch, galloped into Serenity, his horse lathered, his face pale with terror. The black vultures had struck. They had burned the Miller homestead to the ground, killing the entire family. The attack was swift, brutal, and served its purpose perfectly. It plunged the entire valley into a state of panic. An emergency town meeting was called. Marshal Thompson stood before the terrified citizens, his face a mask of grim determination. He slammed his fist on the podium, the sound echoing in the tense silence of the town hall. "This is it," he boomed. "Silas Cain has shown his hand. He's testing us, trying to sow fear. But we will not break. We will not cower. This was an act of desperation, and it will be his last. The time for defense is over. The time to attack is now." He outlined a bold plan. He claimed to have received intelligence from a scout about the location of the vultures' main encampment, a hidden canyon deep in the Badlands. He was going to lead the militia on a preemptive strike, wipe out the gang once and for all. "We ride at dawn tomorrow," he declared. "We will catch them sleeping and send every last one of those devils to hell." The hall erupted in a roar of approval. Fear was replaced by a thirst for vengeance, doubt by a blind faith in their charismatic leader. Jed was there, standing at the back of the hall. He felt a surge of adrenaline, but also a prickle of unease. The plan felt rash. It contradicted everything the Marshal had told him about Cain's cunning, about the likelihood of a feint. After the meeting, Jed sought out the Marshal. He found him in his office, cleaning his revolvers with meticulous care. "Marshal," Jed began, closing the door behind him. "This new planet feels risky. What about the trap we discussed? What about the attack on my ranch?" Thompson looked up, his expression unreadable. He placed his revolver down with a soft, deliberate click. Plans change, Jed. The Miller massacre changes everything. We have an opportunity to end this right now. We have to take it. The best defense is a good offense. But my family, the town will be practically defenseless while you're gone. I'm leaving a small contingent behind under Sheriff Abernathy's command, Thompson said dismissively. Kane's main force will be at the encampment. They won't be expecting us. By the time they know what's happened, it'll be over. Trust me, Jed. This is the right move. The safest move for everyone. The Marshal stood up and walked around the desk, placing a firm, reassuring hand on Jed's shoulder. His blue eyes locked onto Jed's. I need you here, Jed. While I'm gone, I need a man with your skills to be the anchor for the town's defense, just in case. Abernathy is a good man, but he's not you. Your presence here will be a comfort to everyone. It's a vital role. Jed was torn. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. The sudden change of plans, the convenient intelligence, Thompson's placating tonight all felt off. But how could he argue? How could he, a former outlaw, question the judgment of a decorated marshal? To do so would be to accuse him of incompetence, or worse. The entire town was behind Thompson. Jed would look like a coward, or a fool. He looked into the marshal's unwavering gaze and saw only conviction. He had already given the men his trust, his secrets. To pull back now seemed impossible. He had to believe. He had to hope that the marshal's confidence was not misplaced. All right, Marshal, Jed said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. I'll stay. I'll watch over the town. I knew I could count on you, Thompson said, his smile returning, wider and more brilliant than ever. It was the smile of a serpent that had just convinced its victim to stand perfectly still. That night, Jed rode home under a sky full of stars, the vast, silent prairie stretching out around him. A profound sense of foreboding settled over him, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the black vultures and everything to do with the man he had just left. He tried to shake it off, to convince himself it was just the tension of the coming battle. But the feeling lingered, a whisper in the back of his mind that he had just made a terrible, irreversible mistake. He had looked a serpent in the eye and mistaken it for a savior. And as he rode towards the warm, welcoming lights of his home, he was unknowingly riding into the final, peaceful hours before the end of his world. The trap was set, but it was not for the black vultures. It was for him. The dawn that followed was deceptively beautiful. Hues of soft pink and pale orange bled across the horizon, backlighting the rugged peaks of the distant mountains. In the town of Serenity, there was a palpable buzz of anticipation and righteous fury. Marshal Thompson, looking every bit the heroic leader, sat atop a magnificent black stallion, addressing the assembled militia. His voice, crisp and commanding in the cool morning air, was a tonic for their frayed nerves. He spoke of justice, of retribution, of making the valley safe for their wives and children. Jed stood on the boardwalk in front of the general store, a silent observer, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He watched as the men, his friends and neighbors, their faces set with grim determination, rode out of town behind their marshal, a cloud of dust rising in their wake. They were heading east, towards the Badlands, towards a phantom encampment and a lie. Jed's gaze lingered on the empty street, the silence that descended feeling heavy and unnatural. He was left behind to guard a town that had just been willingly stripped of its protectors. The serpent had shed its skin, and the venom was about to be injected. He spent the day in a state of agitated vigilance. He did a circuit of the town's perimeter with Sheriff Abernathy, whose face was a mask of worried inadequacy. The few men left behind were mostly old-timers or young boys, their eagerness a poor substitute for experience. The town felt hollow, vulnerable. Jed's instincts, the ones he had suppressed for so long, were now screaming. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of approaching riders. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking threat. He felt a desperate urge to ride home, to gather Sarah and Sammy and flee into the hills until this was all over. But he had given his word. He was the anchor. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of violent purple and blood red, he could bear it no longer. He found Abernathy in his office. "I'm riding out to my ranch," Jed said, his voice flat and hard. "Something's not right." "But Jed," the marshal said. Abernathy began, his reedy voice full of protest. "I don't care what he said," Jed snapped, his patience worn thin. "My family is out there. I'm going. He didn't wait for a reply. He untied his horse, swung into the saddle, and spurred the animal into a gallop. The ride to his ranch, usually a peaceful, 20-minute journey, felt like an eternity. The setting sun was at his back, casting his long, frantic shadow before him. The dread in his gut had become a cold, solid thing. The Marshal hadn't just been wrong, he had been lying. The attack on the Miller place wasn't a feint, it was a message. And the Marshal's grand expedition to the Badlands wasn't a preemptive strike. It was an alibi. He had deliberately led the town's defenders away, leaving the valley's most prosperous ranch, the one whose every secret he now knew, exposed and defenseless. He was still a mile away when he saw the first sign. A column of thick, black smoke was rising into the darkening sky, a greasy stain against the twilight. It was coming from the direction of his homestead. "No," he whispered, the word a choked prayer. He dug his heels into his horse's flanks, urging it on, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that threatened to break them. No, no, no. The smell hit him next, acrid stench of burning wood and something else, something sickeningly familiar and horrific, the smell of burning flesh. He burst through a stand of cottonwoods and the full, unimaginable horror of the scene slammed into him like a physical blow. His home was an inferno. Flames, impossibly bright and hungry, devoured the house he had built with his own hands, leaping into the sky, sending a shower of glowing embers drifting on the wind like malevolent fireflies. The barn was already a collapsing skeleton of charred timbers. And all round, there were Ritter's black vultures. They were like demons silhouetted against the blaze, their whoops and hollers a symphony of destruction. They were rounding up his cattle, looting his sheds, putting a torch to anything that hadn't already caught fire. For a moment, Jed was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer scale of the nightmare. His mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. Then, a single, galvanizing thought cut through the shock. Sarah and Sammy. The cellar. He had told the Marshal about the cellar. He drew his Colt, the cold, familiar weight in his hand a grim comfort. The rancher was gone. Jedediah the Hawk was back, resurrected in a crucible of fire and despair. He let out a roar, a sound of pure, primal rage, and charged forward, his revolver bucking in his hand. He shot a man off his horse near the burning barn, a second one as he tried to bring his rifle round. They were caught by surprise, not expecting any resistance. But their surprise quickly turned to focused violence. Bullets tore through the air around him. One grazed his arm, a searing line of pain. Another ripped through his horse's neck, and the animal went down with a sickening cry, sending Jed tumbling to the hard-packed earth. He came up shooting, using the body of his dead horse for cover. He was outnumbered 20-1, a suicidal, impossible fight. But he didn't care. He fired with a cold, methodical fury, his years of experience taking over. Every shot found its mark. He was a whirlwind of death, a cornered animal fighting for its young. He dropped another 2 vultures before a rifle but caught him from behind, a blinding flash of pain exploding in his skull. He fell to his knees, his vision swimming. He could hear laughter, cruel and mocking. Strong hands grabbed him, hauling him to his feet, dragging him towards the blazing pyre of his home. And there, standing in the flickering, hellish light, was the leader, Silas Kane. He was a bear of a man, with a matted black beard and eyes like chips of coal. He was holding a torch in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other. "Well, look what we have here," Kane slurred, his voice a gravelly rumble. He took a swig from the bottle. "The man of the house has come home. A little late for the party, though. My wife, my son," Jed rasped, his head throbbing, the world tilting on its axis. "Where are they?" Kane grinned, a truly evil expression that split his beard, revealing yellowed, broken teeth. He gestured with his torch towards the burning house. "Your woman put up a bit of a fight. Got some spirit in her." The boy, he was a screamer. Jed's world collapsed. The strength went out of his legs, and he would have fallen if the men holding him hadn't tightened their grip. A sound escaped his throat, a raw, guttural keen of a soul being torn in two. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. "The Marshal told us you'd be in town," Kane continued, clearly enjoying the moment. "Told us everything. Where you kept your money, the best way in, even about that little hidey hole under the floor. A very thorough man, your Marshal. Paid him a handsome price for the information. And he gets to be the hero who rides in tomorrow to find this tragic scene." The betrayal was now absolute, a physical poison flooding Jed's veins. Thompson hadn't just abandoned them. He had orchestrated this. He had sold them. He had painted a target on their backs and handed the vultures the brush. The shared maps, the secret plans, the concern for his family's safety, it had all been a monstrous, calculated lie. "Kill him," Jed choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Just kill me." Kane laughed again. "Oh, no. Death is too quick. The Marshal was very specific. He wants you to live. At least for a little while. He wants you found in the morning, broken and babbling about the vultures. Another victim for him to avenge." He took another long pull from the whiskey bottle, then casually tossed the rest of it onto the porch of the burning house. The flames roared up with a hungry whoosh. "But I think we can rough you up a bit first," Kane said, his eyes gleaming. "And we'll leave you with a little something to remember us by." He handed the torch to one of his men. From his belt, he drew a long, wicked-looking skinning knife. He walked slowly towards Jed, the firelight glinting on the polished steel. The pain that followed was beyond anything Jed had ever known. It was a searing, white-hot agony that eclipsed the grief, the rage, the betrayal. It was the fire, the knife, the splintering of bone under a heavy boot. He lost consciousness, then was dragged back by another wave of torment. He was vaguely aware of being dragged away from the fire, of being dumped near the creek like a sack of garbage. The last thing he saw before the world went black was the smirking face of Silas Kane, and beyond him, the collapsing roof of his home, a final, fiery punctuation mark on the end of his life. His last conscious thought was a silent scream of Sarah's name. He lay there, broken and bleeding, as the vultures finally rode away, their saddlebags heavy with his life savings, their laughter echoing back on the night air. The fire slowly began to die down, the inferno dwindling to a malevolent, glowing heart of embers. The smoke still billowed, carrying the ashes of his life, of his love, of his foolish, misplaced trust, up into the indifferent, star-filled sky. He was supposed to die there, a tragic footnote in Marshal Thompson's meticulously crafted narrative. But in the smoldering ruins of Jedediah Stone's world, something else was being forged in the immersive specter of vengeance, animated by a hatred so pure and so absolute it refused to let him die. The night of ashes was over, but the ghost was yet to rise. The boundary between life and death is a murky, gray river, and for hours, Jed drifted in its cold and forgiving current. He was suspended in a void of pain, a place where the only reality was the thrumming agony of his body and the echoing screams in his mind. He was a ghost, and tethered from the world, floating through a nightmare landscape of fire and mocking laughter. Fragments of memory pierced the darkness, Sarah's smile as she handed him a cup of coffee in the morning sun, Sammy's small hand clutching his as they walked by the creek. The glint in Marshal Thompson's eyes he sealed their fate. These images were both a comfort and a torment, reminders of a life that was now nothing but a collection of ashes. Death would have been a mercy, a sweet release from the unbearable weight of what he had lost. But death did not come. Instead, came the rain. A cold, steady drizzle began to fall just before dawn, hissing as it struck the glowing embers of the homestead. The rain washed the blood from his wounds, mingling it with the muddy earth. It was a baptism of misery, and it was the shock of the cold water that tethered him, however loosely, back to the world of the living. He coughed, a racking, painful spasm that sent bolts of lightning through his shattered ribs. He was alive. The realization was not a comfort, it was a curse. To be alive was to feel, and to feel was to be consumed by a grief so vast and so profound it threatened to swallow what little was left of him. He lay there for a long time, the rain plastering his hair to his face, his body a map of exquisite pain. He didn't have the strength to move, nor the will. He simply stared at the smoldering, skeletal remains of his home, a black wound on the landscape. This was his tombstone, the monument to his failure. He had failed to protect them. His past had come for him, and instead of meeting it with the cold steel he was known for, he had met it with trust, and that trust had murdered his family. It was in this state of near death that Silas found him. Silas was a prospector, an old man whose face was a roadmap of a hard life, his skin tanned to the consistency of old leather. He lived a solitary existence in the hills with only his stubborn mule, Esmeralda, for company. He had seen the smoke the night before and had come down from the high country at first light to investigate, his natural caution warring with a reluctant curiosity. What he found was a scene of utter devastation and a man who was more dead than alive. Silas was not a man given to sentimentality, but he was also not a man who could leave a fellow creature to die in a ditch. With a series of grunts and curses, he managed to heave Jed's broken body onto Esmeralda's back. The journey to Silas's hidden, ramshackle cabin was a blur of agony for Jed. Every jostle of the mule was a fresh wave of torture, and he drifted in and out of consciousness, his only anchor the old prospector's gruff, muttered encouragements to the mule. The days that followed were a fever dream. Jed lay on a crude cot in the corner of the small cabin, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, herbs, and drying leather. Silas, it turned out, possessed a surprising knowledge of field medicine, learned over a lifetime of fending for himself in the wild. He cleaned and stitched Jed's wounds with a practiced, if not gentle, hand. He set his broken bones as best he could, flinting them with strips of wood and rawhide. He brewed foul-tasting concoctions from herbs that brought down the fever that raged through Jed's body. During his lucid moments, Jed was silent. He stared at the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling, his eyes hollow, haunted. He didn't speak a word. He didn't ask who his savior was or where he was. He barely seemed to register the old man's presence. He was a shell. The man he had been burned out of him, leaving only a husk of grief and self-loathing. Silas, for his part, didn't push. He went about his daily routines, tending to Jed as he would a sick animal, with a detached but consistent care. He'd talk, mostly to himself or the mule, his voice a low, continuous rumble. He spoke of gold veins, of changing weather, of memories from a long-forgotten war. He never asked what happened at the ranch. He didn't need to. The story was written all over Jed's broken body and in the bottomless despair of his eyes. One morning, nearly 2 weeks after the attack, Silas brought over a small, cracked piece of a mirror. "Time you saw what you're up against," the old man said gruffly, holding it in front of Jed's face. Jed stared at his reflection, but the face looking back was that of a stranger. It was a gaunt, ravaged landscape. His cheeks were hollow, his skin stretched tight over his bones. A thick, ragged beard covered his jaw, but it was the scar that held his attention. Silas Kane's knife had carved a brutal, jagged line from his right temple down across his cheek, ending just at the corner of his mouth. The wound had healed into a puckered, angry red mark that pulled the side of his face into a permanent, sneering grimace. It was the face of a monster, a face that reflected the ugliness that had taken root in his soul. It was the brand of his failure, a permanent reminder of the night he lost everything. Seeing that mark, that physical manifestation of his enemy's cruelty, was the spark that reignited the embers within him. For the first time, a flicker of something other than grief appeared in his eyes. It was a cold, hard glint of pure, unadulterated hatred. He reached up with a trembling hand and touched the scar. The man in the mirror was no longer Jedediah Stone, the rancher. That man was dead, buried in the ashes with his wife and son. The reflection was someone new, someone born of fire and pain. That afternoon, he spoke his first words since the attack. His voice was a dry, raspy whisper, and used, and broken. Water. Silas brought him a cup, and he drank greedily. Food. He ate the stew Silas gave him, wolfing it down with a desperate hunger. He was no longer trying to die. He was fueling himself. An engine of vengeance requires fuel. From that day on, his recovery took on a new, grim purpose. He forced himself to move, hissing in pain with every motion, but refusing to stop. He began with small movements, then progressed to sitting up, then to standing, his legs shaking under his own weight. He pushed himself past the limits of endurance, driven by the burning images in his mind. Every stab of pain was a reminder of what Cain had done. Every moment of weakness was a betrayal of Sarah and Sammy's memory. Silas watched the transformation with a quiet, knowing sadness. He had seen men consumed by the thirst for revenge before. It was a poison that preserved the body while it rotted the soul. "Vengeance is a fire that burns the man who holds it," Silas said one evening, as he watched Jed painstakingly cleaning an old revolver the prospector kept in his cabin. Jed didn't look up from his task. The rhythmic click of the cylinder turning was its only sound for a long moment. "Then I will burn," he said, his voice now a low, chilling rasp. "But I will take them with me." He learned what had happened in the aftermath from scraps of an old newspaper Silas had used to wrap some supplies. The official story, Marshal Thompson's story was exactly as Kane had predicted. The noble Marshal and his militia had returned from their heroic, if fruitless, search for the Vulture's lair to discover the horrific tragedy at the Stone Ranch. Jedediah Stone was missing, presumed dead, likely burned to an unrecognizable state in the fire that consumed his family. The article lauded Thompson's tireless dedication to justice, quoting his solemn vow to hunt down Silas Kane and bring him to the gallows. The town of Serenity, united in its grief and fear, had put its complete and unshakable faith in their heroic marshal. They had even raised a substantial bounty for Kane's capture, a bounty collected and managed by Thompson himself. Reading it, Jed felt no surprise, only a cold, hardening certainty. Thompson had not only murdered his family, he had stolen his name, his legacy, turning his tragedy into a stepping stone for his own ambition. He had made himself the hero of a story in which he was the ultimate villain. As his body healed, his new identity began to take shape. He was no longer a man, he was a purpose. He let his beard grow, a wild and tame thing that, along with the scar, rendered him unrecognizable. He took Silas's old, worn-out duster, a garment the color of the dust and shadows. He spent his days in relentless training. He was weak, his body still a wreck, but the muscle memory was there. He practiced his draw over and over, until his hand was a blur, the movements as natural as breathing. The speed was still there, but now it was allied with a terrifying, single-minded focus. There was no joy in it, no pride, only the grim satisfaction of a tool being sharpened for its one and only task. He became a ghost in the high country, learning the hidden trails and secret places from Silas. He learned to move without a sound, to live off the land, to become a part of the unforgiving wilderness. The grief was still there, a constant, aching void in his chest, but he packed it down, compressing it into a diamond-hard core of rage. The love he had for his family had been twisted, perverted into a dark and terrible new form. It was a love that could only be expressed through violence, a love that demanded a final, bloody accounting. The day finally came when he knew he was ready. He was stronger, leaner, and harder than he had ever been. He stood before Silas, the old prospector's revolver holstered at his hip, another tucked into his belt. He was a creature of shadow and dust, his eyes holding the cold, dead light of a distant star. "I'm leaving," he said. It wasn't a question or a request. It was a statement of fact. Silas nodded slowly, chewing on the stem of his unlit pipe. He looked at the man before him, the ghost he had pulled back from the grave. He knew there were no words that could stop him. "Where will you go?" "I'll start with the Vultures," Jed rasped. "But I'll end with the Marshal." Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. He tossed it to Jed. It was filled with gold dust. "A man needs a stake." Jed looked at the gold, then back at the old man who had saved his life. "Why?" "No man should have to face the devil with an empty pocket," Silas said, his expression grim. "And maybe when you're done, you'll remember there's still a soul inside you worth saving. Though I doubt it." Jed gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He turned without another word and walked out of the cabin, disappearing into the vast, indifferent wilderness. He was no longer Jedediah Stone. He was the ghost of Serenity, a specter raised from the ashes, and his hunt was about to begin. The town that had mourned him would soon learn to fear him, and the men who had destroyed his world would soon learn that some graves do not hold their dead. The wilderness became his world, the harsh and unforgiving landscape his only confidant. The man who was once Jedediah Stone stripped away the last vestiges of his former self, piece by painful piece. He abandoned his name, letting it drift away like smoke from a dead fire. He was now a nameless wraith, a hunter defined not by who he was, but by what he was hunting. He moved through the territory like a whisper on the wind, a creature of twilight and dawn, rarely seen, but his presence increasingly felt. His first task was to acquire a horse worthy of a ghost. He used a small portion of Silas's gold in a dusty, forgotten outpost on the far edge of the territory, a place where men didn't ask questions as long as your coin was good. There, he found a stallion as scarred and feral as he was. It was a midnight black creature with a wild eye and a spirit that had resisted every attempt to break it. The horse traders called him Diablo, and they were eager to be rid of him. Jed approached the animal not with a rope and a spur, but with a quiet, patient stillness. He saw in the horse's defiant fury a reflection of his own shattered soul. For hours, he simply stood near the corral, letting the stallion grow accustomed to his scent, his presence. When he finally entered the enclosure, he carried no bridle, no saddle. He spoke to the horse in a low, monotone rasp, the words less important than the intent behind them. An understanding passed between the man and the beast, a recognition of shared wildness and pain. By nightfall, Jed was riding the horse bareback under the moon, the two of them moving as one, a single, dark entity against the pale landscape. He renamed the horse Ash, a constant reminder of the fire that had both ended and begun his life. With his new mount, his transformation into the Shadow Rider was complete. He was no longer just a man on foot. He was a relentless, inescapable force. He became a master of the land, learning its secrets, its rhythms. He could read the meaning in a broken twig, a disturbed patch of earth, the flight of a startled bird. The skills he had learned as a young man, skills he had tried to bury under the life of a rancher, returned to him, honed to a razor's edge by the single-mindedness of his purpose. He could survive for weeks on what the land provided, his senses so attuned to his surroundings that he seemed to melt into the chaparral and canyons, becoming just another shadow in a land full of them. He did not seek comfort. He slept on the hard ground, a saddle for a pillow, the star-strewn sky his only roof. He ate what he could kill, his meals joyless acts of refueling. The cold, the heat, the gnawing hunger welcomed them all. Pain was his penance, a constant reminder of the agony his family had endured. He embraced the harshness of his new existence, for in it, he found a strange kind of purity. The world of men, with its lies and betrayals, its false smiles and hidden daggers, was a world he no longer belonged to. His was a world of stark, simple truths: kill or be killed, hunt or be hunted. Rumors began to trickle through the territory, carried by frightened travelers and wide-eyed prospectors. They spoke of a rider, always seen from a distance, a dark figure on a black horse who moved with a natural speed and silence. They said he had no face, only a scarred visage and eyes that burned like coal fire. Some claimed he was a demon, others the ghost of a man wronged. They called him the Shadow Rider, the Dust Devil, the man who died twice. His legend grew with each telling, a campfire story that began to take on the weight of truth. His first targets were not the vultures themselves, but the network that supported them. He knew that a gang like Silas Kane's could not operate without a chain of supply and information. He started at the fringes, observing the lonely, isolated trading posts and saloons known for catering to the lawless. He would watch for days from a hidden ridge, a patient predator, learning the routines, identifying the men who provided the gang with ammunition, food, and whiskey. His methods were brutal, efficient, and terrifyingly personal. He didn't just kill these men, he dismantled their lives before ending them, making them understand the nature of loss. To a gunrunner who supplied the vultures with rifles, he did not simply put a bullet in his head. He first burned his warehouse to the ground, the man's entire fortune in guns and ammunition cooking off in a spectacular, night-long fireworks display of destruction. He left the man alive, bound and gagged, forced to watch his livelihood turn to ash. Only when the final timber had fallen did Jed appear before him, a terrifying specter emerging from the smoke. "You gave them the guns that killed my son," he would rasp, his voice a sound of grinding stones. The man's pleas for mercy were met with the cold, dead silence of Jed's eyes before a single, precise shot ended his life. To a corrupt quartermaster at a remote army outpost who sold stolen supplies to the gang, he used a different kind of cruelty. He methodically stole the man's ill-gotten gains, leaving behind cryptic symbols drawn in charcoal: a simple, stark S, for Stone, for Sarah, for Sammy. He drove the man mad with paranoia, making him see enemies in every shadow, until the quartermaster, convinced his partners had turned on him, instigated a bloody shootout in his own office. A mess the army would be years sorting out. With each act of retribution, he left a mark. He never took money. He never spoke more than a few chilling words. He was an artist of fear, and his medium was vengeance. The stories of his deeds spread like wildfire, amplifying his legend. He was no common outlaw seeking riches. He was something else, something far more frightening, an agent of a justice that was personal, absolute, and utterly without mercy. The criminal underworld began to tremble. Men who had never feared the law began to fear the shadows. The name Silas Kane was still a threat, but the specter of the Shadow Rider was becoming a deterrent. These early acts of vengeance were also a process of self-discovery, a descent into the darkest corners of his own soul. With every man he killed, he felt a piece of his old self die. The Jed who had valued peace, who had laughed with his son, who had loved his wife with a gentle heart, was fading. In his place was this new, hard thing, an instrument of death. He was haunted by his family, but their memories were no longer a comfort. They were the fuel for his rage, the ghosts that rode with him, demanding payment in blood. He would have nightmares, vivid and horrific. He would see Sarah's face, not smiling as he remembered her, but contorted in terror, her mouth open in a silent scream as the flames rose around her. He would hear Sammy calling for him, his small voice filled with a pain no child should ever know. He would wake up under the stars, his body drenched in a cold sweat, the scar on his face aching as if freshly cut. In these moments, the grief would threaten to overwhelm him, to drown him in a sea of despair. But he would force it back down, channeling the agony into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He would get up, saddle Ash, and ride on, the ghosts of his family driving him forward, their phantom hands pushing him deeper into the darkness. He had ceased to be a rancher. He had become a monument to their memory, a walking, breathing tombstone. And he knew, with a certainty that was the only truth left in his world, that his work had only just begun. The men who had pulled the triggers and held the torches were still out there, and beyond them, sitting in a comfortable office, wearing a shining badge, was the architect of his damnation. The Shadow Rider was coming for them all. The trail to the Black Vulture gang was not a straight line, but a spider's web of fear and corruption, and Jed, the Shadow Rider, moved along its strands with methodical patience. He was no longer just a force of nature, he was an investigator, piecing together the gang's structure from the whispers of terrified men and the evidence left in the wake of his own cold justice. From the dead gunrunner, he had learned of a rendezvous point in the canyons of the Cimarron. From the ledger of the corrupt quartermaster, he had found names and supply routes. Each small victory was a stepping stone, leading him from the periphery of the web closer to its center, where the black heart of the spider, Silas Kane, resided. His hunt for the vultures began in earnest in a god-forsaken town called Purgatory, a collection of clapboard shacks and muddy streets that served as a haven for men on the run. It was a place where a man's past was his own business, and the only law was the one enforced by the fastest gun. Jed rode into town not as a specter, but as a quiet, grim-faced drifter. He kept the brim of his hat low, the collar of his duster high, his scarred face mostly hidden in shadow. He was just another broken man in a town full of them, and he blended in perfectly. He spent his days in the corner of the town's only saloon, nursing a single whiskey, his eyes missing nothing. He listened. He listened to the drunken boasts, the paranoid whispers, the casual talk of violence. He was looking for a name, a face, a connection. After 3 days, he found it. A loudmouth card sharp named Lefty Pete was holding court at a poker table, bragging about a recent raid. He spoke of the fire, the easy money, and the gutless rancher who hadn't been home to protect his own. Jed's blood ran cold. He felt the ghosts of his family pressing around him, their silent screams a roar in his ears. He waited until Lefty Pete, flush with winnings and whiskey, stumbled out into the night alley to relieve himself. Jed followed, a shadow detaching from other shadows. Lefty never saw him coming. One moment he was fumbling with his trousers, the next a hand of steel was clamped over his mouth and a knife was pressed against his throat. The Stone Ranch, Jed rasped, his voice a venomous whisper in the man's ear. "Tell me about it." Terror flooded Lefty's eyes. He had no idea who this man was, only that the voice belonged to death itself. He babbled, the words tumbling out in a panicked stream. He confessed everything. He spoke of the plan, how they had been told the ranch would be an easy target, how the Marshal and Serenity had given them the layout. He named 2 other members of the gang who were also laying low in Purgatory, a hulking brute named Tiny and a nervous, shifty-eyed kid called Billy. He told Jed they were planning to meet up with the rest of the gang in 2 weeks' time at a place called Crow's Peak. "Please," Lefty whimpered when he had no more information to give. "I just followed orders. Please don't kill me." Jed looked into the man's terrified face. He saw no remorse, only the selfish fear of a cornered rat. He thought of Sammy, of the terror his son must have felt in his final moments. "Mercy is for the living," Jed said, his voice devoid of all emotion. The knife moved, a swift, silent motion. He left Lefty Pete's body in the filth of the alley, a warning to the other vermin. He found Tiny in the town's livery stable, a mountain of a man who was drunk and belligerent, abusing the stable boy. Jed didn't use a knife this time. He faced the man directly. Tiny, seeing the scarred face and the dead eyes, laughed, thinking Jed was just another drifter looking for trouble. His laughter was cut short as Jed moved with a speed that seemed impossible. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a brutal, one-sided beating. Jed broke the man's hands first, the hands that had held a torch to his home. Then he broke his legs. He left him a broken, moaning heap in the hay, alive but wishing he were dead. Jed wanted him to suffer, to live with the consequences of his actions. The kid, Billy, was different. Jed found him holed up in a cheap boarding house, his hands shaking so badly he could barely roll a cigarette. He was barely a man, his face covered in the fuzz of youth. When Jed kicked the door in, Billy didn't reach for his gun, he started to cry. He was haunted by what he had done, what he had seen. "I saw the lady and the little boy," Billy sobbed, collapsing to the floor. "I didn't want to. Kane made me watch." Jed looked at the pathetic figure, and for the first time, he felt something other than pure rage. It was a flicker of something he thought was long dead, a bitter, twisted form of pity. This boy was a vulture, yes, but he was also a victim, chewed up and spat out by Kane's evil. Killing him would be like putting down a sick dog. It would not be justice. "Get out of this territory," Jed commanded, his voice a low growl. "Right east and don't ever look back. If I ever see your face again, I will kill you." Billy scrambled to his feet and fled, leaving all his possessions behind, running as if the devil himself were on his heels. Jed had let him live, not out of mercy, but because he had served a different purpose. His terror, the story he would tell, would become another thread in the legend of the Shadow Rider, another whisper on the wind to unnerve his enemies. As he rode out of purgatory, leaving a corpse, a cripple, and a ghost behind him, he felt the weight of his actions settle upon him. In his mind, he saw Sarah. He remembered a time, early in their life on the ranch, when a mountain lion had been killing their calves. Jed had tracked it and killed it. He had felt no pride in the act, only a grim necessity. Sarah had seen the look on his face. "Killing is a heavy burden, Jedediah," she had said softly, "even when it's necessary. Don't let it harden your heart." The memory was a sharp, unexpected pang of grief. He was so far from the man she had loved. That man wouldn't have been capable of the cold-blooded acts he had just committed. He was becoming the very thing she had saved him from, a man whose only language was violence. The thought was agonizing, but it did not deter him. It only strengthened his resolve. He was doing this for them, to honor their memory. The cost to his own soul was irrelevant. He was already damned. His path was now clear. Crow's Peak. He rode hard, the landscape blurring around him. During the long days in the saddle and the longer nights by the campfire, the memories of his family became more intense, more vivid. They were not the gentle, comforting memories of his life as a rancher. They were sharp, fragmented images from the time before, from his life as a gunslinger. He remembered teaching Sammy how to whittle, but the memory was overlaid with the image of him teaching the boy how to hold a pistol, something he had sworn he would never do. He remembered Sarah's laughter, but it was drowned out by the imagined sound of her screams. These twisted, tormenting flashbacks did not weaken him. They were like a whetstone, grinding away any softness, any doubt, leaving only a razor-sharp edge of purpose. He was a weapon being honed by his own grief. The man who had sought peace was now an avatar of war. The love for his family, once a source of warmth and light, had become a cold, dark star, its gravity pulling him forward on his terrible trajectory. Each man he put in the ground was a prayer for his lost wife and son, a bloody tribute to their stolen lives. The whispers on the wind were no longer just rumors about a ghost rider. They were the harbingers of a coming storm. A storm of vengeance that was about to break upon the unsuspecting heads of the Black Vulture gang. The trail to Crow's Peak was a journey into the heart of the Badlands, a desolate, sun-scorched expanse of cracked earth, towering buttes, and winding, rock-strewn canyons. It was a land that mirrored the landscape of Jed's soul, empty, hostile, and stripped of all softness. For days, he and Ash moved through this brutal terrain, a solitary, dark speck against the vast, indifferent canvas of the West. He was no longer just following the information tortured out of Lefty Pete. He was hunting, his senses alive, attuned to the subtle language of the wilderness. He found their trail tracks of shod horses, the remnants of a hastily abandoned campfire, a discarded chariot of a specific brand he now associated with one of King's lieutenants. He was closing in. The vultures, feeling the heat from the strange, violent events in purgatory, had become skittish. They were moving fast, trying to reach the relative safety of their mountain stronghold. But Jed was relentless. He was a superior horseman with a superior mount, and he possessed a knowledge of the land that the outlaws, for all their experience, could not match. He didn't follow directly behind them. That would be too easy. Instead, he shadowed them, using the high ridges and parallel canyons to keep them in his sight, a predator stalking his prey, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. His first opportunity came at a place called Diablo's Spine, a narrow, treacherous pass through a high ridge. He knew the trail well. It was a natural choke point, a place where a few men could hold off an army or where a single, determined man could cause chaos. He scouted the pass ahead of the gang, finding the perfect spot, a high, rocky ledge overlooking a sharp bend in the trail. He dismounted, leaving Ash hidden in a cluster of rocks, and scaled the cliff face, his movements as silent and sure-footed as a mountain cat's. From his perch, he had a clear view of the trail below. He was armed with his revolver, a repeating rifle, and a cold, patient fury. He didn't have to wait long. The vultures rode into the pass with a careless confidence, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. There were about a dozen of them, a grim-looking collection of hard men. Jed waited until they were at the deepest point of the bend, clustered together, before he opened fire. His first shot was not aimed at a man, but at a precariously balanced rockslide above the trail, a weakness in the cliff face he had noted earlier. The high-powered rifle slug slammed into the rock, and with a deafening crack, tons of rock and debris cascaded down onto the trail. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The lead riders were crushed, their screams cut short. The path ahead was completely blocked, and the terrified horses reared and panicked, throwing the gang into utter confusion. From his perch, Jed began his deadly work. He was not a wild shooter. Every shot was deliberate, precise. He wasn't just killing them, he was dismantling them, targeting the most dangerous-looking men first. A burly outlaw raising his rifle was spun around by a shot to the chest. Another, trying to calm his horse, slumped from the saddle. Panic turned to terror as the vultures realized they were being attacked by an unseen enemy, a ghost in the rocks. They fired wildly at the cliffs, their bullets ricocheting harmlessly, their shouts of anger turning to cries of fear. Jed moved from position to position, a phantom marksman. He would fire 2 shots from one location, then scramble silently along the ledge to another, making it seem as if they were besieged by multiple shooters. He used the terrain, the echoes, the confusion, as weapons. In less than 5 minutes, half the gang was dead or dying on the canyon floor. The remaining few, including Silas Kane's trusted second-in-command, a vicious killer named Court, broke ranks and fled, scrambling back the way they had come, abandoning their dead and wounded. Jed let them go. This wasn't about annihilation, not yet. This was about fear. He wanted the survivors to carry the tale of the ambush back to their leader. He wanted Silas Kane to know that something was hunting him, something that was not the law, something that could strike from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. He descended from his perch as the dust settled, the only sounds the moans of a dying man and the buzzing of flies that were already beginning to gather. He walked among the dead, his face an impassive mask. He looked at their faces, searching for any flicker of recognition, any connection to the night of the fire, but they were just hired muscle, anonymous agents of his family's murder. He felt nothing for them, no pity, no satisfaction, only a cold, empty finality. He collected their weapons and ammunition, resupplying himself, and then, without a backward glance, he rode away, leaving the bodies for the real vultures to find. The trail led him next to a dilapidated, isolated ranch that served as one of the gang's supply depots. The surviving vultures, led by Court, had taken refuge there, their nerves shattered. Jed watched the ranch for a full day, learning its layout, the number of men, their routines. He decided to attack at night. He approached under the cover of a moonless sky, a true specter of the dark. He disabled the single guard with a thrown knife, the blade thudding into the man's chest with a sickening wet sound. He moved to the barn first, where he knew the gang kept their horses. He wasn't there to kill the animals, he was there to trap his prey. Working quickly and silently, he doused the barn with oil from a lantern and barricaded the main door from the outside with a heavy wagon. Then, he set it on fire. The blaze took hold with terrifying speed, the dry old wood of the barn erupting into a column of flame. Shouts of alarm rose from the ranch house as the men inside were roused by the light and the sound of their screaming, trapped horses. They burst out of the house, panicked and disoriented, running towards the barn, and straight into Jed's line of fire. From the shadows of the corral, he opened up on them. It was a massacre. He cut them down as they ran, their silhouettes perfectly illuminated by the fire they had rushed to fight. Court, the second in command, was the last to fall. He managed to draw his weapon, his face a mask of disbelief and rage in the firelight. "Who are you?" he screamed into the darkness. Jed stepped out of the shadows, letting the firelight illuminate his scarred face. "I'm the man whose family you burned," he said, his voice a low, chilling growl. Recognition, followed by sheer terror, dawned in Court's eyes. He tried to raise his pistol, but Jed was faster. The shot was a single, deafening crack in the night. Court crumpled to the ground. The fire in the barn was a mirror of the one that had consumed his own home, a roaring monument to his vengeance. He stood there for a long moment, the heat on his face, the smell of smoke filling his lungs. He was becoming what he beheld. He was a creature of flame and retribution. As he watched the barn collapse into a heap of embers, he did not feel the satisfaction he thought he would. He felt only a vast, aching emptiness. He had killed more than a dozen men, had dismantled a notorious gang piece by bloody piece, but it had brought him no closer to peace. It had not brought Sarah and Sammy back. He knew then, with a chilling certainty, that this path did not lead to salvation. It led only to more graves. But it was the only path he had left. He had called the pack. Now, only the leader, Silas Kane, remained. And beyond him, the true serpent, Marshal Thompson. He turned his back on the fire and mounted ash. The trail of the vulture had been a bloody and brutal one, but it had led him to this point. His next ride would be his last as a hunter. His next ride would take him back to Serenity, back to where it all began, for the final, terrible accounting. The news of the Black Vulture Gang's annihilation at Diablo's Spine and the subsequent massacre at the supply ranch traveled faster than a prairie fire. The stories, told by a handful of terrified survivors who had scattered to the four winds, were wild and contradictory. They spoke of a demon in the rocks, a phantom who moved through the night, a single rider who fought with the fury of 10 men. They spoke of a scarred face, eyes that held no light, and a voice that sounded like death itself. The legend of the Shadow Rider, once a collection of campfire whispers, now solidified into a terrifying reality across the territory. In the town of Serenity, however, these stories were filtered through the narrative of their hero, Marshal Clayton Thompson. Thompson, ever the master manipulator, seized upon the news and twisted it to his own advantage. He stood before the townsfolk and declared that his relentless pursuit of justice had broken the gang's spine, forcing them to turn on each other in a bloody, desperate struggle for survival. He painted a picture of a gang imploding under the pressure of his law, with this mysterious ghost rider likely being a rival outlaw seeking to claim the Vulture's territory. He was the hero, the strategist whose actions had led to this victory. The people of Serenity, wanting to believe in the safety he promised, cheered him, their trust in him more absolute than ever. But beneath the surface of his calm, confident exterior, Thompson was a man wrestling with a growing unease. The descriptions of the Ritter's relentless focus, the brutal efficiency, the particular brand of psychological warfare were unsettlingly familiar. They didn't speak of a common outlaw. They spoke of a man driven by something personal, something Thompson had thought he had buried under a pile of ash and rubble. The possibility, however remote, began to gnaw at him. Could Jedediah Stone have survived? He dismissed it as a paranoid fantasy. The man had been left for dead, broken and bleeding. No one could have survived that. Still, He discreetly sent riders to the site of the stone ranch, telling them to search the ruins again to look for any sign, any bones, that could confirm Stone's death. They found nothing. It was into this atmosphere of feigned confidence and private fear that Jedediah Stone returned. He did not ride into Serenity like a conquering hero or a vengeful specter. He came at dusk, walking, leading Ash behind him, looking like just another weary traveler. The wild beard, the dusty duster, the deep shadows under his hat, and the horrifying scar that twisted his face made him unrecognizable to the people who had once been his neighbors. He was a ghost walking in his own graveyard. The town had changed. There was an air of tension that had not been there before. Men wore guns more openly. The laughter from the saloon seemed louder, more brittle. Marshal Thompson had built fortifications at either end of the main street, and his hand-picked deputies, swaggering men with cruel eyes who were loyal only to him, patrolled the boardwalks. He had used the fear he helped create to cement his power, turning Serenity into his own personal fiefdom. Jed took a room at the boarding house, the one at the quiet end of town, paying with a small gold nugget. He spoke little, his voice a low rasp that discouraged conversation. He spent the first day observing, watching, feeling the rhythm of the town he once called home. He saw the faces of people he knew: the blacksmith, the store owner, the preacher, and saw in their eyes a mixture of fear and a desperate, willful belief in the Marshal. They had traded their freedom for the illusion of safety. He walked past the smoldering ruins of his own life, a journey that was both an agony and a necessity. He stood where his front porch used to be and looked at the blackened earth where he had last seen his wife and son. The grief was a physical thing, a crushing weight in his chest. But he did not weep. The time for tears was long past. He was here to balance the ledger. His presence began to be felt, a subtle shift in the town's atmosphere. People noticed the quiet, scarred stranger. They saw the way he watched everything, his gaze missing nothing. They saw the way he moved, with a coiled, predatory grace that spoke of a capacity for sudden violence. Whispers started. Who was he? What did he want in Serenity? The Marshal's deputies tried to intimidate him, surrounding him one afternoon as he stood in front of the sheriff's office. "You got business here, stranger," one of them sneered, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. Jed slowly turned his head, his eyes, cold and dead, rising from beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't say a word. He simply looked at them, and in that gaze, the deputies saw a promise of a death so swift and so final it made their blood run cold. They were bullies and thugs, used to preying on the weak. This man was not weak. They backed away, muttering curses, and nerved. The confrontation did not go unnoticed. Thompson, watching from his office window, felt a jolt of ice in his veins. He couldn't see the man's face clearly, but there was something in his posture, his stillness, that triggered a primal alarm. He sent for Sheriff Abernathy. "Who is that man?" Thompson demanded, his voice sharp. Abernathy, now a pale shadow of his former self, a puppet whose strings were pulled by the Marshal, squinted out the window. "Don't know, Marshal. Drifter. Came in a couple of days ago. Keeps to himself." "Find out," Thompson commanded. "I don't like surprises." That evening, Jed made his first move. He waited until the town was quiet. Then he went to the cemetery. He found the two simple wooden crosses that marked the graves of Sarah and Sammy Stone. They were in a corner of the cemetery, a plot paid for by the grieving town. He knelt before them, the first time he had allowed himself such a moment of vulnerability. He didn't speak. He just rested a hand on the earth of each grave, a silent communion with the ghosts who drove him. Then he went to work. From his saddlebag, he took a branding iron. It was an iron he had made himself, a simple, stark letter S. In the blacksmith shop, whose owner was long home in bed, he heated the iron in the dying embers of the forge until it glowed a malevolent red. He went to the Marshal's office. The door was locked. He kicked it in with one powerful, splintering blow. The sound echoed through the silent town like a gunshot. He strode to the Marshal's desk, the desk where the betrayal had been planned, and he pressed the glowing iron into its polished surface. The wood sizzled and smoked, and the letter S was burned deep into the grain, a brand, a claim, a message. S for Stone. S for Sarah. S for Sammy. S for Serpent. He was gone before the first curious resident or roused deputy arrived to see the source of the commotion. The discovery of the broken door and the brand on the desk sent a shock wave through the town. It was a direct, personal challenge to the Marshal's authority. Thompson stared at the brand, his face pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the desk. All his doubts, all his fears, coalesced into a single, terrifying certainty. It was him. Jedediah Stone was alive. The ghost he had created had come back to haunt him. The hunter had become the hunted. The tension and serenity became a palpable, suffocating thing. The townsfolk were caught between their fear of the unknown, this violent stranger who dared to challenge their protector, and the dawning, terrifying suspicion. The Shadow Rider, the ghost of the territories, was here, in their town. And his presence was inextricably linked to the tragedy of the Stone family. The carefully constructed facade of peace and order that Marshal Thompson had built began to crack, and through those cracks, the ugly truth was beginning to seep. The stage was set. The players were in place. The final act was about to begin, not in a hidden canyon or a remote ranch, but here, in the heart of the town that had been betrayed, under the watchful eyes of the people in whose name the crimes had been committed. The morning of the reckoning dawned gray and oppressive, the sky the color of old iron. A nervous quiet hung over serenity, a stark contrast to the simmering tension that had been building for days. Shops remained closed, their windows like vacant eyes. The townsfolk stayed indoors, peering out from behind curtains, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and morbid anticipation. They were no longer sure who the villain was, or who the hero might be. They only knew that their town had become the stage for a final, deadly confrontation. The brand on the Marshal's desk had been a declaration of war, and the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for the first shot to be fired. Marshal Clayton Thompson was a man besieged. The ghost he thought he had laid to rest had not only risen but had cornered him in his own fortress. His carefully crafted persona of the righteous lawman was crumbling, both in his own mind and in the eyes of the town. The swagger was gone, replaced by the haunted, twitchy paranoia of a man who sees shadows in every corner. He had gathered his deputies, the handful of hired guns who were loyal to his coin, not to any notion of the law. They were posted on rooftops and in alleyways, their rifles glinting in the flat, grit light. Thompson had turned the town into a free-fire zone, his last desperate attempt to control the narrative and eliminate the man who embodied the truth. Jedediah Stone, the Shadow Rider, waited. He was not hiding. He was simply biding his time, letting the tension build to an unbearable peak. He sat in his room at the boarding house, cleaning his cold peacemaker with a slow, deliberate calm. He was no longer a whirlwind of rage. The fire had burned down to a single, cold, white-hot point of purpose. He was not here for a chaotic gunfight. He was here for an execution, but one that had to be witnessed. The truth had to be brought into the light before the final darkness fell. At precisely 5 minutes to noon, he stood up. He strapped on his gun belt, the familiar weight a comforting finality. He donned his duster, pulled his hat low, and walked out of the boarding house and into the main street. He was a solitary figure of death, walking slowly, deliberately, down the center of the dusty, empty road. His footsteps were the only sound, each one a drumbeat marking the final seconds of Clayton Thompson's life. From his office window, Thompson saw him. The long walk, the utter lack of fear, it was a direct challenge, a call-out in the classic tradition of the West. His first instinct was to order his snipers to shoot him down like a dog. But he hesitated. To kill the man from a hidden position would be an admission of cowardice, an admission of guilt. He had built his reputation on being a hero, a man of courage. He had to face this. He had to control the story, right to the bitter end. "Hold your fire," he snarled to his deputies through the window. "He's mine." He strapped on his own twin revolvers with their gleaming ivory handles. He took a deep breath, straightened his coat, and walked out onto the boardwalk, positioning himself in front of the sheriff's office, directly in Jed's path. The two men stood 50 yards apart, the length of the street a vast, empty stage. The hidden audience watched, breathless. Jed stopped, his feet planted in the dust. He slowly pushed his duster back, clearing the path to the worn, wooden handle of his Colt. "Stone," Thompson called out, his voice a strained imitation of his usual confident boom. "I should have known. They told me you were dead." "You were misinformed," Jed's voice rasped, carrying with an unnatural clarity in the silence. It was the first time most of the townsfolk had heard him speak, and the sound sent a chill down their spines. "You're a fool for coming back here," Thompson blustered, trying to regain control. You're a wanted man, Stone. An outlaw. The murderer of the Black Vulture gang. I'm placing you under arrest. He was playing to the unseen crowd, casting himself as the lawman, Jed as the criminal. Jed gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The lies are over, Thompson. It's just you and me now. And the ghosts of my family. Your family was the victim of a tragic outlaw attack, Thompson shouted, his voice rising in pitch. An attack I have sworn to avenge. You didn't avenge them, Jed said, his voice dropping, becoming colder, more menacing. You sold them. You drew Silas Kane a map to my home. You told him where my wife and son would be hiding. You told him where my money was. You sent the men of this town on a fool's errand so Kane could do your dirty work for you. A collective gasp went through the town, audible even from behind the closed doors. This was the accusation they had all secretly feared, the terrible truth that explained everything. Thompson's face, already pale, turned ashen. The accusation, spoken so plainly, so certainly, in the open street, had shattered his facade. You're insane. You're a grieving man making up stories. There's no proof. The proof is in the ground, into graves in your cemetery, Jed retorted, his voice thick with a raw, controlled pain. And the proof is in the brand I left on your desk. A mark for the serpent you are. He took one step forward. You did it for money, for power, for the chance to be the hero of a tragedy you authored. But every man has to pay his debts. And your bill has come due. The pretense was over. Raw, naked fear and hatred twisted Thompson's features into an ugly mask. His hand hovered over the ivory handle of his right-hand Colt. I'll see you in hell, Stone. The world seemed to slow down. The gray light, the dust motes hanging in the air, the terrified faces in the windows had all frozen a single, perfect moment before the explosion. Thompson was fast, his reputation as a gunfighter not entirely unearned. His hand blurred as he drew, the gleaming revolver clearing the holster. But Jedediah Stone was not fast. He was something else entirely. He was a force of nature, an extension of the vengeance he embodied. His hand moved in a single, fluid, economical motion. There was no flash, no bravado, just the cold, grim mechanics of death. His Colt was out-aimed, and fired before Thompson's barrel had even leveled. The shot was a single, deafening crack that broke the spell of silence. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of Marshal Thompson's pristine white shirt, directly over the star he had so proudly polished. A look of profound, bewildered surprise crossed his face. He looked down at the blossoming red stain, then back up at Jed. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. His own gun, fired, slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered onto the boardwalk. He staggered back a step, then collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, his body hitting the wooden planks with a heavy, final thud. Silence descended once more, thick and absolute. From the rooftops, Thompson's deputies, who had their rifles trained on Jed, did nothing. They had seen the truth of the draw. This was no outlaw. This was a reckoning. They quietly lowered their weapons and faded back out of sight. Jed stood unmoving for a long moment, his pistol still smoking in his hand. He looked at the body of the man who had destroyed his world, and he felt nothing. No triumph, no relief, just a vast, hollow emptiness. The fire that had driven him for so long had consumed its fuel, and now there was only cold ash. Doors began to open. The townsfolk, led by a trembling Sheriff Abernathy, cautiously stepped out into the street. They looked at the dead Marshal, then at the scarred, solitary figure standing over him. They saw not a murderer, but a man who had borne an unimaginable weight, a man who had clawed his way back from the grave to deliver a justice their town had been denied. He had returned their false savior and, in doing so, had restored a terrible, brutal kind of truth. Jed slowly holstered his revolver. He turned his back on the body, on the town, on the past. Without a word, he walked back to where Ash was waiting. He swung himself into the saddle, a weary, almost infinitely tired movement. He looked one last time at the faces of the people of Serenity, his face an unreadable mask of grief and pain. Then he turned his horse and rode away, not into the sunset, but into the flat, gray emptiness of the plains, a man who had paid for justice with his own soul. The departure of the Shadow Rider left a void in Serenity, a silence far more profound than the one that had preceded the gunfight. The body of Clayton Thompson lay on the boardwalk, a testament to the town's catastrophic failure of judgment. No one rushed to cover him. His corpse, stripped of its authority and charisma, was just a dead man in the dust, the physical proof of a deep and corroding lie. The townsfolk stood in stunned, silent clusters, looking from the dead Marshal to the lone rider shrinking on the horizon. The gunshot had been an ending, but it was also a brutal beginning start of their own reckoning. Sheriff Abernethy was the first to move. With a new, albeit shaky, authority, he directed a few men to carry Thompson's body to the undertakers. There was no talk of a grand funeral. The hero of Serenity had died with his final lie, and the truth of his villainy settled over the town like a shroud. In the days that followed, the story was pieced together from hushed conversations and the dawning, horrified understanding of the townsfolk. They remembered Thompson's convenient absences, his too smooth explanations, his masterful manipulation of their fears. They had been willing accomplices in their own deception, so desperate for a savior that they had failed to see the serpent in their midst. The deputies Thompson had hired, men loyal only to his silver, vanished overnight, melting back into the lawless territories from which they'd come. Serenity was left to fend for itself, stripped of its false protector and its armed guards. But something had changed. The fear that had once paralyzed them was replaced by a grim, communal resolve. They had survived the vultures. They had survived the betrayal of a corrupt lawman. They had witnessed a ghost return from the dead to exact a terrible justice. They were no longer sheep waiting for a shepherd. Jed, now once again just Jed, rode without purpose. The fire of vengeance had been his compass, his fuel, his entire reason for being. Now that it was extinguished, he was adrift in a vast, empty wilderness, both outside and within. He rode for days, barely eating, barely sleeping, letting Ash wander where he willed. The ghosts of Sarah and Sammy were still with him, but their presence had changed. The sharp, angry edges of their memory had softened, leaving behind a deep, resonant ache. They were no longer screaming for vengeance. They were whispering of loss, of a life that could never be reclaimed. He had won. He had killed the men who murdered his family. He had exposed the architect of his pain. But it felt like a hollow, bitter victory. The hole in his soul had not been filled. Peace had not returned. He was still the man with the scar, the man with the haunted eyes. He had become a master of death, but he had forgotten how to live. His journey led him, perhaps inevitably, back to the one place he had known a sliver of kindness after his world ended, the hidden cabin of Silas, the old prospector. He found the place just as he had left it. Silas was sitting on his porch, mending a piece of tack, his mule Esmeralda grazing nearby. The old man looked up as Jed approached, his eyes taking in the weary slump of Jed's shoulders, the profound emptiness in his gaze. "So," Silas said, his voice its usual gravelly rumble. "It's done." It wasn't a question. Jed dismounted and simply nodded, too tired for words. "And did it bring them back?" Silas asked, his eyes sharp and knowing. A single, dry sob escaped Jed's lips, a sound of such profound despair it seemed to be torn from the very earth. "No," he whispered. "It never does," Silas said quietly. He put down his work. "Get down, son. Rest a while. The world ain't going nowhere." Jed stayed with Silas for weeks that turned into months. He didn't speak of what happened in Serenity, and Silas didn't ask. There was a quiet and spoken understanding between them. Jed chopped wood, hunted for game, and helped Silas with his endless chores. The physical labor was a balm, a way to exhaust his body and quiet the roaring in his mind. He was slowly, painstakingly, learning to be in the world again without the all-consuming fire of hatred to guide him. One day, a traveling preacher, making a wide circuit through the back country, stopped at Silas's cabin for a night's rest. Over a simple meal of rabbit stew, he shared news from the territories. He spoke of the town of Serenity. It was a changed place, he said. The people had formed a proper town council. They had elected old Sheriff Abernethy as their mayor, and the man, to everyone's surprise, had risen to the occasion, leading with a quiet, humble integrity. They had started a school. They were rebuilding. They were healing. The preacher also spoke of a legend, a story that was now told all across the West. The story of Jedediah Stone. They said he was a man who had lost everything because of his faith in the wrong man, a man who had become a ghost to hunt down evil. In his story, the people of Serenity had found a new kind of hero, not a flawless man with a shining badge, but a broken man who had fought his way through hell to reclaim a measure of justice. His act of vengeance had, ironically, become a catalyst for hope. It had forced a town to look into the darkness and find its own strength, its own light. Hearing this, Jed felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't felt in a lifetime. It wasn't happiness, and it wasn't peace, not yet. But it was a sense that his terrible journey had not been entirely without meaning. He had not just brought death, he had, in his own dark way, brought about a new beginning for the town he had once loved. He had but turned Marshal Thompson before the entire town, and in doing so, had not only avenged his family but had also restored a semblance of justice and given the people of Serenity a chance to rebuild on a foundation of truth. The next morning, Jed saddled Ash. He was still a man marked by tragedy, his scar a permanent reminder of his loss. The ghosts of his family would likely ride with him forever. But the all-consuming rage was gone, replaced by a quiet, enduring sorrow. "Where will you go now?" Silas asked, standing on the porch. "I don't know," Jed answered honestly. "But I think I'll ride west, towards the setting sun." There was a finality in his tone, but also a sliver of possibility. He was no longer running from a past that haunted him or charging towards a future of bloody revenge. He was just a man, riding towards a new horizon, carrying his grief not as a weapon, but as a part of who he now was. He extended a hand to the old prospector. "Thank you, Silas, for everything." Silas gripped his hand firmly. "Find some peace for yourself, son. You've earned it." Jed nodded. He swung into the saddle and, without looking back, rode away. He disappeared into the vast expanse of the American West, a solitary figure moving toward the distant promise of a new day. He left behind a town reborn and a legend that would be told around campfires for generations, a story of the Shadow Rider, the man who had lost his family to a false belief, but who, in the end, had given the town back its hope.